Tonight, we are traveling back to the final chapters of the Age of Dinosaurs, a time when life on Earth appeared not fragile, but overwhelmingly strong. 66 million years ago, life on Earth was thriving, not just surviving, flourishing. The dinosaurs had been here for over 150 million years, and in those final chapters, they had grown into some of the most extraordinary forms the planet had ever seen. Predators with jaws that could crush bone, herbivores armored like fortresses, horns and crests and spines that seemed almost excessive, built not just for survival, but for display, for competition, for dominance. The forests were dense, the food chains were full. Every niche was occupied by something large, something specialized, something that had spent millions of years becoming exactly what it was. Scientists who study this period sometimes describe it as a world running hot, not in temperature, in intensity. Evolution had been building and refining for so long without major interruption that life had grown elaborate. Power was everywhere. Balance was hard to find. But what happens when natural selection keeps escalating without restraint? And why would evolution allow life to grow so overbuilt, just as the margin for change was disappearing? Tonight, we'll walk through that world. We'll meet the giants who had no reason to expect an ending. But before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into deep time, calm, curious, and filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this video a like and maybe tapped subscribe. It helps more dreamers find their way to this peaceful little corner of science. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, let your breath slow, let your body settle, and together, let's drift into the world of the late Cretaceous. Before the world began to strain under its own abundance, life followed quieter rules. They were not written anywhere, yet they shaped every forest, shoreline, and shallow sea. Change came slowly, almost patiently, guided by small advantages repeated across long stretches of time. Survival was not about winning quickly, but about lasting gently, about fitting into the narrow space that a landscape allowed, and no more. In most ages, evolution moved like a careful sculptor. Each generation tested tiny variations, keeping what helped and letting the rest fade away. A slightly stronger limb meant better movement across uneven ground. A marginally sharper tooth made feeding more reliable. A thicker leaf caught more sunlight without stealing too much from the soil below. These changes were modest, but they accumulated with steady confidence. Life rarely rushed, it adjusted. The environment played a quiet but constant role in this process. Food availability, climate shifts, competition, and disease acted as patient editors. Anything that demanded too much was quietly discouraged. A body that grew heavier than food could support struggled during lean seasons. An armor that took too much energy to maintain left fewer resources for growth and reproduction. A weapon that required constant use risked injury when it mattered most. Excess was not punished dramatically, it was simply unsustainable. Because of this, balance tended to emerge on its own. Traits came with costs as well as benefits, and those costs kept extremes in check. Speed often came at the expense of endurance. Size improved defense, but increased hunger. Precision increased efficiency, but reduced flexibility. Over time, these trade-offs formed a kind of invisible equilibrium. No organism could maximize everything at once, and so most became good at only what they truly needed. This balance did not require intention or foresight. It arose from countless small failures that never made it far. A lineage that leaned too far in one direction faded quietly. Another that stayed within the margins persisted. The natural world did not aim for perfection, only for adequacy, enough strength to survive. enough flexibility to adapt, enough reproduction to replace loss. Across most of Earth's history, this filtering worked reliably. Extreme traits appeared from time to time, but they rarely spread widely. They were tested quickly and often removed just as quickly. A towering body might dominate for a moment, then vanish during a drought. A specialized feeder might thrive briefly, then disappear when its favored resource declined. The world remained diverse because no single strategy held the field for long. This gentle pruning created ecosystems that felt resilient. They bent rather than snapped. When conditions shifted, some species declined, but others took their place. Energy flowed through many pathways instead of a few narrow ones. Life remained layered, flexible, and forgiving. Stability was not stillness, it was motion contained within limits. In such systems, success was quiet, dominance was temporary, survival meant staying compatible with change. Evolution, under these conditions, acted less like a race and more like a conversation between organism and environment. Each adjustment was answered by another, never straying too far from what the world could support. Against this backdrop, the patterns that followed later become harder to ignore. The rules themselves did not vanish, but their usual effects softened. Trade offs stopped restraining growth. Costs delayed their consequences. Traits that once would have been trimmed back began to persist, then multiply. What had always been filtered now lingered. This foundation matters because it shows what normally prevents escalation. It explains why most eras remain moderate, why ecosystems rarely push themselves to their limits. Understanding this quiet balance allows the next chapters to unfold with clarity, not as a sudden break from nature, but as a slow departure from its usual restraint, where the familiar safeguards loosened and the old corrections arrived too late. As time continued its slow passage, something subtle shifted beneath the surface of familiar patterns. The quiet balancing act that had guided life for so long did not break all at once. It thinned. Pressures that once countered each other began to align instead. Where strength had once met scarcity, abundance softened restraint. Where size had once been checked by hunger, food flowed just enough to delay consequence. The world did not announce this change, it simply stopped correcting it. In earlier ages, every advantage carried a shadow. A gain in one direction was met by loss in another, and together they kept bodies and behaviors within gentle limits. Now those shadows grew faint. Conditions overlapped in a way that allowed advantages to accumulate rather than cancel. A larger body no longer paid an immediate price. A thicker defense did not yet slow reproduction. A sharper weapon brought success without swift penalty. Each improvement rested comfortably atop the last, forming layers instead of boundaries. This stacking altered the rhythm of evolution. Selection pressures that once tugged in opposite directions began to pull the same way. Growth encouraged more growth. Strength rewarded additional strength. Specialization invited deeper specialization. Success reinforced itself quietly, like footsteps wearing a deeper path through soft ground. The longer a trait persisted, the more the environment adjusted around it, making that trait even more effective. Escalation no longer required intention or competition alone. It emerged automatically. Once a lineage gained an edge, that edge reshaped the conditions experienced by others. Predators that could overpower more easily changed how prey survived. Prey that endured longer encounters encouraged predators to become even more extreme. Plants that grew faster altered nutrient cycles, supporting larger bodies that in turn demanded even more growth. Each response amplified the next. What made this moment unusual was not speed, but persistence. Normally, escalation burned itself out, costs caught up, resources thinned, flexibility returned as necessity. Now those breaks failed to engage. Favorable conditions lingered just long enough for traits to spread widely before their costs were felt. By the time restraint arrived, designs were already committed. The system had momentum. Moderation depended on timely feedback, and that feedback grew delayed. Environmental signals still existed, but they arrived softened and late. Seasonal variation mattered less in a warm, productive world. Local shortages were buffered by abundance nearby. Losses that once would have ended a lineage became survivable pauses instead. Life did not notice the missing warning signs because nothing collapsed immediately. As a result, traits that once would have remained rare began to dominate landscapes. Extremes became common enough to redefine normal. The average organism now carried characteristics that would once have marked the edge of survivability. Bodies filled space more fully, niches narrowed as success favored specific solutions over adaptable ones. Diversity remained, but it clustered around a few increasingly intense strategies. This self reinforcing cycle reduced the role of restraint further. When most competitors shared similar excess, there was no advantage in returning to moderation. Smaller, lighter, or more flexible forms struggled to compete in a world optimized for confrontation and endurance. They did not disappear at once, but they lost ground slowly, pushed to the margins by designs that excelled under current conditions. Over time, the absence of corrective pressure became its own force. Evolution continued, doing what it had always done, rewarding what worked in the present moment. The difference lay in the landscape it now operated within. With few penalties for going too far, selection no longer shaped traits toward balance, it shaped them toward continuation, even when continuation required increasingly narrow circumstances. The planet still felt abundant, still felt powerful, but the quiet equilibrium that once absorbed stress had faded. Traits moved forward without guidance back. Escalation became the default direction, not because life sought it, but because nothing opposed it. What had once been a conversation between organism and environment became an echo, repeating the same advantages louder each time. Balance did not vanish in a dramatic break. It slipped away gently, unnoticed, as the world leaned into excess and found no reason to stop. By the time balance had quietly slipped away, interaction itself began to change. Encounters that once ended quickly now stretched longer. A chase did not resolve as easily. A bite did not always finish the exchange. Survival increasingly depended on what followed first contact, not on avoiding it. In this new rhythm, improvement became contagious. Predators were the first to lean into the opening. Small advantages mattered more than before. A slightly stronger jaw ended struggles faster. A longer reach turned hesitation into capture. Better vision widened the moment between detection and escape. These refinements did not appear suddenly, but they accumulated with surprising ease, carried forward by success that faced little resistance. Prey answered in kind, though not by choice. A hide that thickened by chance absorbed more damage. A body that carried extra mass endured longer in a grasp. Spikes, plates, and reinforced bone offered time rather than safety, but time was enough. A few extra seconds meant escape, healing, reproduction. Those seconds became valuable currency, and traits that bought them spread. Each improvement reshaped the environment the other side faced. A predator that struck harder favored prey that could withstand impact. Prey that resisted more effectively favored predators that struck even harder. This exchange repeated again and again, tightening like a spiral. There was no pause between rounds, no season of rest where escalation slowed. Every success rewrote the rules of the next encounter. What made this arms race different from earlier ones was its lack of conclusion. In the past, Escalation often stalled, costs caught up, or environments shifted. Now the loop fed itself. Better defenses made stronger offenses necessary. Stronger offenses made heavier defenses worthwhile. Neither side gained lasting resolution. Advantage existed only briefly before it demanded expansion. This cycle required constant upgrading. Traits that once would have been adequate for an entire lifetime now risked becoming obsolete within a few generations. A predator could not remain merely effective. It needed to stay ahead. A prey species could not rely on sufficient protection. It needed more, thicker, stronger, layered. Maintenance replaced sufficiency as the guiding principle. The world itself absorbed the weight of this exchange. Energy flowed faster through food webs, pulled by organisms that demanded more intake just to sustain their designs. Growth had to be constant. Repairs had to be continuous. There was little room for pause. Organisms that slowed, even briefly, lost ground. Survival became less about efficiency and more about endurance. This automatic escalation left little space for retreat. Simplification no longer paid off. A lineage that shed armor or reduced weaponry did not gain enough flexibility to compensate for the immediate risk. Moderation became vulnerable. The landscape rewarded commitment, even when that commitment narrowed options elsewhere. Specialization deepened as a result. Predators tuned their tools to specific defenses. Prey shaped their bodies around particular threats. This focus sharpened interactions, but reduced adaptability. Each side became better at confronting the other, but worse at handling change outside that relationship. The arms race drew attention inward, away from the broader environment. Over time, confrontation shaped appearance itself. Bodies told stories of conflict through their outlines. Limbs thickened where force traveled, bones fused where stress repeated. Teeth, horns, claws, and armor became dominant features rather than supplementary ones. The living world took on the look of readiness, as if each organism carried its history of battles in its form. Yet, there was no victor. The race produced no final design that ended competition. Each improvement simply raised the baseline for the next. What counted as safe yesterday became inadequate tomorrow. What once guaranteed success now merely postponed failure. The cycle did not know how to stop because nothing within it suggested an alternative. Escalation had become automatic, not driven by aggression or intent, but by structure. The system rewarded movement in only one direction. To remain viable meant to continue upgrading, to add rather than subtract, to build upon what was already heavy, already demanding. In doing so, life pressed forward without rest, shaped by an arms race that no longer ended, only deepened. As the long exchange of improvement deepened, one pattern began to appear again and again across land and sea. Amid sharper teeth and thicker armor, lengthened reach and reinforced bone, a simple truth emerged without announcement. Being larger changed everything. Size altered encounters before they began. A greater mass cast a longer shadow, one that communicated resistance without movement. Many attacks never started at all. Predators paused when faced with bodies that promised difficulty. Prey avoided targets that would demand too much effort. In a world shaped by escalation, hesitation itself became a form of protection, and size created hesitation naturally. When contact did occur, larger bodies endured more. Extra tissue absorbed force. Thicker bones resisted breakage. Greater muscle provided leverage in moments of struggle. Injuries that would have ended a smaller organism became survivable setbacks. Healing followed. Life continued. Survival favored those who could remain standing after impact, not those who avoided it entirely. This advantage did not require precision or specialization. It worked broadly across many encounters and environments. Size did not need perfect timing or exact placement. It offered a buffer, a margin where mistakes were not immediately fatal. In a world where escalation had become automatic, margins mattered more than elegance. As a result, size spread quickly as a strategy. Lineages that grew slightly larger survived longer and reproduced more reliably. Over generations, slight increases accumulated, carrying bodies beyond former limits. Once large size became common, it encouraged further growth. Predators faced bigger prey and gained from becoming larger themselves. Prey faced larger predators and benefited from adding mass. The feedback loop tightened. This shift reshaped landscapes. Footprints deepened. Vegetation bent under greater weight. Food webs stretched to support rising demands. The physical presence of life became harder to ignore, filling space more fully than before. Rivers, plains, and forests carried organisms that felt solid and imposing, built to remain rather than pass lightly through. Size also simplified interaction. In a crowded world, it reduced uncertainty. Larger organisms dominated space and resources by default. They reached food first, defended territory more effectively, and displaced others without direct conflict. Smaller forms still existed, but they adapted around giants, living in gaps, shadows, and overlooked spaces. The center belonged to the large. This strategy felt reliable because it worked repeatedly. Each successful survival reinforced it. Each avoided attack validated it. Over time, size became a common answer to many challenges, not because it solved them elegantly, but because it reduced immediate risk across a wide range of encounters. Yet hidden beneath these benefits were costs that accumulated quietly. Larger bodies demanded more energy simply to exist. Every movement required greater effort. Every heartbeat pushed blood through longer vessels. Feeding became a constant necessity, not a periodic event. Missing a meal carried greater consequence than before. Growth itself slowed reproduction. Larger organisms matured more slowly, requiring extended periods of stability to reach breeding age. Losses could not be replaced quickly. A sudden change in conditions left fewer opportunities to recover. What size offered in durability, it took in responsiveness. Mobility also changed. Turning became slower, acceleration diminished. While size deterred many threats, it reduced options when deterrence failed. Escape routes narrowed. Shelter grew scarce. Environments that shifted even slightly could become incompatible with bodies built for former conditions. These costs did not outweigh the benefits immediately. The world still provided enough warmth, food, and space to support large forms. The problem size introduced remained delayed, visible only as faint pressures rather than urgent failures. Evolution, focused on present success, continued to reward growth. As this pattern spread, it further entrenched escalation. Once bodies crossed certain thresholds, returning to smaller forms offered no advantage. Large organisms shaped the environment in ways that favored continued largeness. Paths widened, plants responded to heavier grazing, predators adapted to abundant mass. The system leaned into its own momentum. Size became not just an attribute, but an expectation. Survival increasingly assumed a minimum bulk. Those below it faced heightened risk. Those above it thrived, at least for now. The hidden costs remained, waiting quietly, accumulating beneath layers of success as life continued to grow heavier, slower, and more dependent on conditions staying just as they were. As bodies grew heavier and encounters grew longer, protection stopped being a feature and became a lifestyle. What had once been occasional reinforcement slowly turned into permanent construction. Layers thickened, surfaces hardened, bones broadened, fused, and braced against forces that no longer arrived as rare events, but as expected parts of survival. Defense was no longer something an organism used. It was something it was. Armor demanded devotion. Building it required steady access to minerals, nutrients, and energy, drawn from soil, water, and prey. Maintaining it required constant repair. Cracks formed under stress, plates wore thin, spikes chipped and dulled. Even standing still carried cost, as weight pressed on joints and tissues that had to remain strong simply to hold form. As more energy flowed toward protection, it quietly drained from other needs. Healing slowed. Wounds closed, but not as quickly as before. Growth after injury took longer. Reproduction adjusted as well. Fewer offspring were produced, and they required longer care before reaching independence. Investment shifted toward making each individual harder to kill rather than making many that could replace loss. This trade changed how populations behaved over time. Numbers no longer surged in response to opportunity. Recovery from decline became slower. Losses that once would have been absorbed over seasons now left lasting impressions. Armor offered survival in the moment, but it stretched the time needed to rebuild after damage. Heavy defenses also shaped movement. Bodies built for protection favored stability over speed. Turning became deliberate. Acceleration softened. Escaping danger relied less on flight and more on endurance. When retreat failed, organisms endured instead, absorbing force rather than avoiding it. This strategy worked well in familiar conditions, where threats were known and repeated. But familiarity came at a cost. Heavily defended bodies became specialized for specific pressures. Plates aligned to deflect common attacks. Spines oriented toward likely angles of approach. Everything assumed the world would continue to present the same challenges it always had. Variation declined as designs settled into proven configurations. This settling narrowed the range of viable forms. Once an organism committed to armor, reversing course became difficult. Lighter descendants struggled to survive alongside heavily defended relatives. Intermediate forms suffered the disadvantages of both, lacking full protection without regaining speed or efficiency. Evolution found fewer safe paths to explore. Adaptability declined without announcement. The ability to respond to new conditions faded gradually, masked by continued success against familiar threats. Defense protected against direct confrontation, but offered little against changes in temperature, vegetation, or resource availability. Armor could not help an organism migrate faster or switch diets easily. It preserved the present at the expense of future flexibility. The environment itself began to reflect this shift. Landscapes filled with creatures that looked prepared for impact, not change. The sound of movement grew heavier. Trails deepened where mass passed repeatedly. Plants adapted to grazing and trampling by growing tougher and faster, reinforcing the cycle that demanded protection in the first place. These designs felt reassuring in the moment. Encounters ended with survival more often than before. Predators withdrew injured. Prey endured attacks that once would have been fatal. Life appeared robust, well defended, and confident in its ability to persist through force. Yet beneath that appearance, options quietly closed. The cost of maintaining armor left little surplus. When conditions shifted even slightly, there was less energy to redirect toward change. Growth patterns were set. Reproductive timing was fixed. Behavioral flexibility narrowed as bodies dictated how movement and feeding could occur. Defense had become a way of life, not a response. It shaped bodies, energy budgets, and expectations. It offered protection from known dangers while slowly eroding the capacity to handle the unknown. In doing so, it carried life deeper into designs that were hard to modify and harder to abandon, even as the world around them continued its slow, patient drift toward change. As defenses hardened and bodies committed to protection, offense followed the same path, not as a choice but as a necessity shaped by what remained possible. Armor raised the threshold of harm. What once ended an encounter now barely registered. To overcome resistance, force had to increase, and it did so gradually, generation by generation, pressed forward by survival that favored decisive outcomes. Jaws grew stronger where muscle could anchor more deeply into bone. Limbs extended to strike from safer distances. Teeth thickened, sharpened, and rearranged to concentrate pressure at the moment of impact. Each improvement was subtle on its own, yet together they transformed how damage was delivered. Contact became shorter but more intense, aimed not at wounding but at overcoming reinforcement outright. This escalation reshaped behavior as well as form. Predators no longer relied on repeated attempts or prolonged struggle. Success favored those that could end encounters quickly, before energy drained or retaliation accumulated. Speed still mattered, but precision mattered more. A well-placed bite, a controlled strike, or a single committed lunge offered higher reward than persistence. As offensive traits intensified, they demanded integration with the body as a whole. Powerful jaws required reinforced skulls. Extended reach required altered balance. Enhanced bite force placed stress on joints, tendons, and teeth that had to endure repeated use. These were not additions that could be removed easily. Once built, they shaped how an organism moved, fed, and interacted with its world. Predators became specialized as a result. Tools designed for particular defenses worked best against familiar opponents. A jaw built to crush armor excelled at that task, but proved inefficient elsewhere. Teeth shaped for slicing struggled with different textures. Limbs optimized for one type of strike lacked versatility in others. Dominance came from matching weapon to target with increasing specificity. This narrowing brought success, but it reduced options. Diets focused, hunting strategies refined. The world was interpreted through a smaller set of expectations. When conditions aligned, these predators performed exceptionally well. When they did not, adjustment became difficult. The same traits that offered control constrained experimentation. Flexibility faded quietly. A predator carrying extreme weaponry could not easily switch prey or behavior. The cost of maintaining offensive structures left little surplus for alternative strategies. Learning new approaches offered limited benefit when bodies were already optimized for one method. Change required redesign, not adjustment. These weapons also reshaped the rhythm of life. Feeding became episodic but intense. Long intervals separated moments of decisive action. Recovery mattered as much as pursuit. Teeth broke, bones fractured. Repairs demanded time and energy. Each successful hunt carried hidden wear that accumulated across a lifetime. In earlier ages, offensive traits could be lost or softened when conditions shifted. Now they persisted. Once a lineage crossed certain thresholds, retreat was costly. Losing power meant losing competitiveness immediately. Intermediate forms struggled to survive, caught between past dominance and future adaptation. The safest path remained forward, even when forward narrowed further. The environment adapted around these weapons. Prey responded with defenses tuned to specific threats. Habitats shifted to favor concealment or distance. Interaction patterns stabilized around known dangers, reinforcing specialization on both sides. The system became efficient within its own frame, even as that frame grew rigid. Dominance felt stable because it repeated itself. The same strategies worked again and again until they did not. But failure remained distant, softened by abundance and familiarity. In the present, power was rewarded. In the present, specialization succeeded. Evolution, attentive only to what worked now, continued to reinforce designs that could not easily be undone. Weapons that could not be unbuilt became signatures of this age. They defined bodies, behaviors, and expectations. They offered control over known challenges while quietly closing doors to others. In exchange for dominance, life accepted rigidity, carrying forward forms that excelled within narrow bounds, shaped by an escalation that left little room for anything else. As escalation reshaped bodies and behaviors, the planet itself offered quiet encouragement. Warmth lingered across long stretches of time, not as sudden heat, but as a steady easing of constraint. Seasons softened, cold retreated, growth windows lengthened until they overlapped and blurred. In this gentle climate, life found fewer reasons to pause. Warm conditions encouraged expansion at every level. Plants pushed upward and outward with little interruption, their tissues forming quickly and densely. Forests thickened, canopies layered themselves, and open ground filled faster than it could clear. In the water, microscopic life multiplied with ease, feeding larger forms that followed predictable currents of abundance. Energy entered ecosystems more readily and moved through them faster. High productivity changed expectations. Scarcity, once a frequent editor, appeared less often. Food shortages became local rather than widespread, temporary rather than defining. Organisms could afford larger bodies because nourishment arrived reliably enough to sustain them. Growth no longer carried the same risk it once had. Bigger forms could mature, feed, and reproduce before facing meaningful limitation. As a result, mass accumulated throughout food webs. Herbivores grew heavier to process abundant plant matter. Predators followed, supported by prey that could sustain them. Each level reinforced the next, creating chains of increasing demand and supply that moved with surprising speed. Energy flowed upward rapidly, converted into muscle, bone, and armor without long delays. This acceleration altered timing itself. Life cycles compressed in some places and stretched in others, but overall activity increased. Feeding, growth, and repair occurred continuously rather than in pulses. Ecosystems hummed with motion, layered with organisms operating near the upper limits of what warm conditions allowed. Yet this abundance carried subtle consequences. Rapid productivity left less margin for error. Systems became tightly coupled, their components relying on constant input to maintain structure. Interruptions that once might have passed unnoticed now traveled further, their effects amplified by dependence. When growth never slowed, there was little opportunity to absorb disruption. Food webs grew faster but thinner. Energy moved quickly, but it also passed through fewer alternative routes. Specialization deepened as organisms tuned themselves to reliable resources. Redundancy diminished. If one link faltered, pressure rippled outward rather than dispersing quietly. What appeared vigorous became sensitive beneath the surface. Warmth also reshaped geography. Habitats expanded into areas once limited by cold. Species spread widely, filling available space with similar strategies. Diversity remained, but it clustered around designs optimized for productivity rather than resilience. Local variations softened as global conditions aligned, encouraging uniformity over experimentation. The pace of interaction increased as well. Predation cycles shortened, recovery periods shrank. Competition intensified in productive zones where many organisms converged on the same resources. Success favored those that could process energy quickly and convert it into presence, pushing systems closer to their capacity limits. In this environment, stability depended less on balance and more on continuity. As long as warmth persisted and productivity remained high, the system functioned. It did not seek equilibrium so much as forward motion. Growth fed growth, masking fragility with abundance. But underlying structures weakened quietly. Soil nutrients cycled faster and depleted locally. Water systems carried heavier biological loads. Populations hovered near maximum levels, leaving little buffer against loss. The system could sustain impressive mass, but it struggled to accommodate pause or change. This was not collapse, nor even visible strain. It was a subtle narrowing of tolerance. The range of conditions under which life could operate shrank even as life itself expanded. Warmth made growth easy but adjustment harder. High productivity supported large bodies but discouraged restraint. The planet, running hot, became a place where success relied on conditions staying familiar. Ecosystems thrived under their own momentum, drawing strength from warmth while quietly surrendering flexibility. Everything seemed full, active, and alive, even as the hidden supports that once moderated excess softened beneath the steady heat. As warmth and productivity continued to propel growth, the demands placed on living bodies grew just as steadily. Size, armor, and weaponry all carried weight that had to be fed every day. Massive forms required constant intake, not only to move and hunt, but simply to exist. Muscles burned energy at rest, bones demanded maintenance, even stillness consumed resources. Life, now built heavy, could no longer afford long pauses between meals. Feeding became continuous rather than occasional. Large herbivores spent most of their waking hours processing vegetation, stripping leaves, grinding stems, moving methodically from one patch to the next. Predators followed these flows of biomass closely, timing their efforts to the movements of prey that sustained them. Every link in the chain depended on steady input, flowing without interruption. This dependence tightened margins throughout ecosystems. There was little excess to store, little reserve beyond what moved through bodies each day. Energy budgets balanced narrowly, matching intake to expenditure with little room for loss. Missing a meal no longer meant temporary discomfort. It meant falling behind a curve that was difficult to rejoin. As a result, small disruptions began to matter more than they once had. A brief dry period reduced plant growth just enough to thin grazing herds. A minor shift in temperature altered flowering cycles, creating shortfalls that traveled upward. Local disturbances, once absorbed quietly, now propagated through systems tuned to constant throughput. These changes did not announce themselves as crises. They appeared as subtle delays, slower recovery, thinner bodies, missed reproductive opportunities. Individuals survived, but populations grew more vulnerable. The time required to rebuild after loss stretched longer, even as demands remained high. Famine margins narrowed further as specialization deepened. Many organisms depended on specific food sources that matched their physical designs. Large bodies could not easily switch diets. Heavy jaws built for one texture struggled with another. Digestive systems tuned to abundant, consistent resources faltered when variety became necessary. Flexibility, already reduced, offered little relief. This fragility extended to behavior. Migration routes became fixed, timed to predictable growth patterns. Disruption along these paths carried disproportionate impact. A single blocked corridor or delayed bloom forced large numbers into competition for reduced resources. Crowding intensified stress, accelerating decline rather than spreading it out. Energy demands also shaped reproduction. Producing offspring required surplus, and surplus grew rare. Breeding seasons shortened, fewer young were raised successfully. Losses that might once have been balanced across years now accumulated. Each generation carried forward the weight of the previous one without full recovery. Predators faced similar pressure. A successful hunt delivered substantial energy, but failure came at high cost. Chasing prey required significant expenditure, and repeated failures drained reserves quickly. Injuries healed slowly under constant demand. A brief period of scarcity could remove even dominant hunters from the system. Ecosystems as a whole ran close to their limits. Biomass filled available space nearly completely. Nutrients cycled rapidly, leaving little accumulation. The system functioned efficiently, but efficiency replaced resilience. There was no slack, no extra capacity waiting to be used during hardship. Under these conditions, survival became a matter of timing and continuity. As long as inputs remained steady, life persisted with impressive scale and complexity. When inputs wavered, even slightly, consequences multiplied. The larger the body, the more immediate the effect. The very traits that had ensured dominance now amplified vulnerability. This was not a sudden collapse, but a steady tightening. Each small disruption left traces that did not fully resolve before the next arrived. Recovery lagged behind demand. Populations thinned unevenly, creating gaps that destabilized local interactions. The system remained impressive, but it felt strained, like a structure bearing weight without pause. Survival, once buffered by moderation, grew fragile under abundance. Life had built itself to endure force and confrontation, but not interruption. With energy demands near the breaking point, persistence depended on conditions staying reliably generous. Beneath the surface of growth, the cost of constant feeding pressed quietly, shaping a world where continuity mattered more than strength, and where even minor disruptions carried lasting weight. As energy demands tightened and survival grew more exacting, the world itself felt increasingly full. Space, once shared loosely among many strategies, filled with living mass. Every shoreline, forest floor, canopy, and shallow sea carried bodies shaped to take advantage of what remained. There were fewer empty places, fewer pauses between lives. Biomass pressed into every available niche, occupying not only the obvious spaces, but the margins as well. This fullness changed how life interacted. Where gaps once allowed recovery and retreat, competition now arrived immediately. A fallen tree did not create open ground for long. It was claimed quickly by growth already waiting nearby. A decline in one population rarely created relief for others. It invited invasion instead. Opportunity did not linger. It was absorbed. Competition intensified quietly but continuously. It did not erupt as constant conflict. Instead, it became a background pressure present in every feeding, every movement, every reproductive effort. Organisms competed not just for food, but for timing, access, and position. Being early mattered, being slightly larger mattered, being established mattered more than ever. Crowded conditions favored those already successful. Dominant forms expanded into adjacent spaces, tightening their hold. Smaller or less specialized organisms found fewer openings to exploit. Even temporary advantages were quickly challenged, eroded by neighbors tuned to recognize and respond to weakness. In a world this full, success drew immediate attention. Local shortages became harder to contain. When resources dipped in one area, movement toward nearby abundance intensified pressure there as well. Grazing spread outward, thinning vegetation beyond the original scarcity. Predators followed prey across boundaries, extending stress rather than isolating it. What began as a localized issue rippled outward through dense networks of dependence. Because margins were already narrow, these ripples mattered. Populations that lost even a small fraction of their numbers struggled to regain footing. There were few empty niches waiting to be reclaimed. Vacancies were filled quickly, often by competitors rather than descendants. Recovery slowed not because growth was impossible, but because space had nowhere to open. This dynamic altered the rhythm of ecosystems. Instead of cycles of loss and renewal, systems experienced accumulation and compression, disturbances stacked on top of each other. Before one impact could fully resolve, another arrived. The system remained active, but its capacity to reset diminished. Crowding also reduced diversity of response. When many organisms shared similar strategies and requirements, they responded to stress in similar ways. Failure clustered. A shortage did not affect just one lineage. It touched many at once. The lack of variation amplified impact, making outcomes more uniform and harder to offset. Movement patterns grew constrained under these conditions. Migration routes overlapped and narrowed. Seasonal shifts concentrated bodies into predictable corridors. Any disruption along these paths carried weight disproportionate to its size. Delay or blockage forced crowding elsewhere, accelerating depletion rather than spreading risk. The sensory texture of the world changed as well. Sound carried farther through dense life. Movement stirred dust, water, and vegetation constantly. There was less quiet, less stillness. Every environment felt occupied, watched, contested. Life did not rest easily because rest itself invited encroachment. Reproduction reflected this pressure. Producing offspring no longer guaranteed space for them to thrive. Many failed not because conditions were immediately hostile, but because there was simply no room to grow. Competition began early and never eased. Selection favored those that could establish quickly and hold ground firmly. Recovery slowed at every level. Individual healing demanded energy already committed elsewhere. Population rebounds required space that no longer existed. Ecosystem repair depended on slack that had been consumed by growth. Each disturbance left a lasting impression, even if nothing visibly collapsed. Crowded worlds offered abundance in appearance, but little cushioning beneath. They functioned efficiently, filling every corner with life, yet they absorbed shock poorly. When pressure arrived, it had nowhere to dissipate. It traveled instead, compressing systems already operating near their limits. The planet felt alive and active, full almost to overflowing. But beneath that fullness lay a quiet rigidity, a condition where motion continued without rest and where the absence of empty space made recovery a slow and uncertain process. As crowded worlds pressed life into constant competition, efficiency became a quiet advantage. Organisms that could extract more energy from specific resources gained an edge, not by being stronger or larger, but by wasting less. Diets narrowed as bodies tuned themselves to particular foods that were abundant and reliable. A plant eater refined teeth, jaws, and digestion to process one type of vegetation quickly. A predator focused on prey that matched its weapons and behavior. These adjustments improved success within familiar conditions. Specialization spread because it worked. Energy that once went toward flexibility was redirected toward performance. Digestion became faster, feeding time shortened, growth accelerated where resources aligned perfectly with design. In a full world, efficiency meant arriving first and staying fed longer. For a time, it looked like optimization. As traits narrowed, options quietly closed. An organism built to eat one thing did it better than competitors, but struggled to switch when availability shifted. A change in plant composition or prey movement required adjustments bodies could no longer make easily. Teeth shaped for one texture performed poorly on another. Digestive systems optimized for consistency resisted variation. Behavior followed form, reinforcing reliance on specific patterns. This dependence deepened as generations passed. Offspring inherited increasingly refined designs, each step improving efficiency within shrinking boundaries. Traits that once allowed flexibility faded because they offered no immediate benefit. In a stable environment, there was little reason to maintain tools that were rarely used. Evolution trimmed them away quietly. Success began to depend on continuity. Specialized organisms thrived as long as the world behaved as expected. Predictable seasons, steady food sources, and familiar competitors allowed them to dominate local spaces. They moved through their days with precision, tuned to a rhythm that rewarded repetition. But this precision left little tolerance for disruption. When conditions shifted, even slightly, the costs of specialization appeared quickly. A delayed bloom, a minor shift in prey distribution, or a subtle change in nutrient cycling created gaps that specialists could not bridge. Their efficiency, once an advantage, became a constraint. Change did not need to be dramatic to matter. Small variations accumulated into meaningful differences. A few missed feeding opportunities weakened bodies already operating near energy limits. Reproduction faltered. Recovery slowed. What generalists might absorb as inconvenience, specialists experienced as threat. This trap was not immediately visible because it developed gradually. For long periods, specialized organisms flourished. Their dominance reinforced the strategy, encouraging further refinement. Competitors that retained broader diets struggled to keep pace and were often pushed aside, the landscape filled with forms exquisitely tuned to current conditions. Adaptability faded as a result. Behavioral flexibility declined when bodies made certain actions inefficient or impossible. Movement patterns locked into specific routes and timings. Learning offered limited benefit when physical design constrained choice. Innovation slowed, replaced by refinement of what already worked. Communities reflected this narrowing. Food webs tightened around key resources. Interactions became predictable and efficient, but less redundant. Alternative pathways for energy flow diminished. When a primary resource faltered, there were few backups ready to take over. Stability became a requirement rather than a preference. The continued success of these systems depended on the environment remaining within a narrow range of conditions. As long as it did, life operated smoothly. When it did not, responses were limited and slow. This dependence on stability marked a shift in risk. In earlier ages, change filtered out excess gently, opening space for new strategies. Now, change threatened the foundation itself. Systems designed for efficiency struggled to accommodate novelty. What once would have been an opportunity became a hazard. Specialization had delivered impressive performance, but it carried an unspoken cost. It exchanged resilience for refinement. In doing so, it bound survival to the persistence of conditions that had shaped it. As the world continued its slow, unpredictable motion, life found itself increasingly committed to paths that worked beautifully, but only as long as nothing asked them to change. By this point in the long unfolding, the world looked impressive in every visible way. Bodies were large, reinforced, and well armed. Movements carried weight. Encounters ended decisively. From a distance, life appeared powerful, confident, even invulnerable. Strength seemed to fill every landscape, written into bone, muscle, and scale. Extreme traits signaled success. Heavy armor reflected survival through countless encounters. Massive size suggested control over space and resources. Specialized weapons implied efficiency and dominance. These features were easy to see and easy to trust. They offered clear evidence that life had adapted well to the challenges it faced. Armor looked especially reassuring. Thick plates and reinforced hides reduced visible injury. Many attacks failed outright. Predators withdrew, prey endured. The surface of life appeared protected, sealed against harm. Movement slowed but continued. Encounters left marks, but rarely ended in immediate loss. Size carried its own authority. Larger bodies displaced others without effort. They claimed territory through presence alone. Many competitors stepped aside before conflict began. Height, mass, and reach created hierarchy without constant struggle. Dominance seemed built into the physical outline of these organisms. Weapons reinforced this image. Precision, force, and reach made success repeatable. Predators struck with confidence born from specialization. Prey carried defenses matched carefully to those threats. The system looked balanced, refined, and stable, shaped by long adaptation. Yet this appearance masked something quieter. Strength, as displayed, focused on surviving known pressures. It did not address what lay outside those boundaries. The same traits that protected against immediate harm narrowed the range of conditions organisms could tolerate. Armor prevented injury but demanded constant upkeep. Resources committed to protection were no longer available for growth, reproduction, or change. Bodies built for endurance under force struggled with prolonged scarcity or shifting climates. The surface remained intact even as internal reserves thinned. Size, too, carried hidden costs. Large bodies required constant feeding and predictable conditions. They moved slowly through change, unable to adjust pace or direction easily. What looked dominant under stability became cumbersome when timing faltered or pathways shifted. Specialized weapons locked predators into specific relationships. Success depended on prey continuing to behave and appear as expected. When that alignment changed, weapons lost relevance. A tool designed for one challenge offered little advantage against another. Flexibility had been sacrificed for efficiency. At the level of systems, these traits aligned into structures that appeared strong but lacked redundancy. Food webs depended on narrow flows of energy. Populations clustered around specific resources and strategies. The removal or reduction of one element strained others quickly. The system did not bend easily. It resisted until it reached limits, then failed abruptly. This weakness remained hidden because conditions stayed favorable long enough to reinforce confidence. Warmth persisted, productivity remained high, familiar cycles repeated. The absence of visible failure encouraged deeper commitment to existing designs. There was little incentive to preserve traits that supported resilience rather than performance. The illusion grew stronger as extremes multiplied. Every successful generation seemed to confirm that bigger, heavier, and more specialized worked best. Feedback favored continuation, not caution. The system rewarded what was already dominant, reinforcing the belief that strength equaled safety. But this safety was situational. It relied on the world staying within narrow bounds. It assumed continuity where none was guaranteed. When pressure arrived from directions outside established defenses, response options were limited. What looked like power was often rigidity. What appeared stable was often brittle beneath the surface. The traits that defined success excelled at resisting direct challenge, but struggled with gradual change. They preserved form rather than function. This illusion extended across entire ecosystems. Dense, productive environments felt secure, yet they absorbed disturbance poorly. Recovery lagged, adaptation slowed. The absence of immediate collapse concealed accumulating stress. Strength, in this age, was real but incomplete. It protected life from familiar dangers while quietly exposing it to unfamiliar ones. The system stood tall, armored and massive, confident in its design, even as the qualities that once allowed life to adjust, adapt, and renew had thinned beneath the weight of visible success. By now, the pattern no longer required pressure from conflict or environment to continue. It moved on its own. Traits kept advancing not because the world demanded them, but because nothing asked them to stop. Each generation inherited momentum already in motion, carrying designs shaped for intensity forward into the next moment without reconsideration. Evolution continued to do what it always had, favoring what succeeded most recently. The difference lay in what success now meant. Survival no longer came from moderation or adaptability. It came from sustaining excess. Bigger bodies that endured stress lived longer. Heavier defenses that resisted damage persisted. Specialized weapons that worked reliably in familiar encounters spread. Once established, these traits reinforced their own importance. There was no built-in mechanism to reverse this. Evolution does not plan or reflect. It does not recognize excess as a problem unless excess fails immediately. Here, failure stayed delayed. Costs accumulated slowly, spread thinly across time and space. No single generation paid the full price of what it inherited. As a result, nothing within the system pushed traits back toward restraint. Escalation became blind, not reckless, but unseeing. Each step forward relied on the last, building complexity and mass without testing alternative paths. Traits grew heavier, more specific, more demanding. They moved forward because that was the only direction offering short-term survival within the existing structure. This motion reshaped the meaning of balance. Balance once emerged from opposing forces that canceled each other out. Now those forces aligned. Selection pressures stacked instead of countering. When traits went too far, there was no immediate correction. Instead, they persisted, passed on, and multiplied. The system felt busy rather than stable. Life did not rest within constraints. It surged continuously, converting energy into structure, pressure into form. Movement replaced equilibrium. Growth replaced adjustment. Evolution flowed like a current with no bend, carrying everything along regardless of where it led. This momentum altered expectations across ecosystems. Organisms became tuned to constant change in one direction. Escalation was assumed. Standing still became disadvantageous. Lineages that did not intensify lost ground quickly. The safest position was forward, even when forward narrowed available options. Innovation slowed within this motion. New designs required space to experiment and fail, but the system offered little room for such exploration. Success followed known paths. Refinement replaced creativity. Variation clustered around existing extremes rather than branching outward. Diversity remained visible, but it was shallow, repeating similar themes with increasing intensity. The absence of reversal also meant that correction could no longer be gradual. In earlier times, excess trimmed itself through ordinary selection. Here, trimming failed to occur. Pressure built invisibly, stored within systems, stretched tight by constant demand. There was no gentle release. The planet carried this momentum quietly. Landscapes bore the weight of life, moving forward without pause. Nutrients cycled rapidly, bodies filled space fully. The system worked, but it worked narrowly, supported by conditions that had to remain consistent for motion to continue smoothly. Balance, when it existed, used to feel calm. It allowed oscillation, recovery, variation. Motion now dominated instead. Everything leaned into continuation. The present moment ruled decisions made without awareness of what lay beyond it. This was not chaos. It was order driven too far in one direction. A structured world, efficient and impressive, but increasingly dependent on remaining just as it was. Momentum carried life forward without guidance, shaping forms that could survive today while quietly limiting the ability to respond tomorrow. Evolution had not failed. It had not changed its rules. It simply followed them without breaks, pushing traits forward because nothing within the process asked whether forward was still the right way to go. As momentum carried life forward without pause, a quieter truth began to separate itself from the noise of size and strength. Beneath armor, muscle, and weaponry, survival rested on something less visible. It rested on stability, the ability to endure not just pressure, but change. Flexible organisms live differently within the same world. They did not dominate space or overwhelm competitors through presence alone. Instead, they tolerated variation. Their bodies were built with margins rather than extremes. They carried traits that worked well enough across many conditions instead of perfectly within one. When food sources shifted, they adjusted diets. When temperatures drifted, they altered behavior. When habitats transformed slowly, they moved or adapted without rebuilding themselves entirely. This flexibility came from restraint. Lighter bodies required less constant feeding. Broader diets allowed substitution rather than collapse. Reproductive strategies favored numbers or speed over individual durability. These organisms did not resist change directly. They flowed with it, absorbing disruption by changing form, behavior, or timing. Overbuilt organisms responded differently. Their designs resisted change at first. Armor deflected damage. Size absorbed impact. Specialized systems continued functioning as long as conditions matched expectations. This resistance created the impression of superiority. When disturbances arrived, these organisms appeared unaffected, while others faltered. But resistance came with a limit. Overbuilt bodies depended on precise alignment between design and environment. When conditions shifted beyond that alignment, adjustment proved slow or impossible. Heavy structures could not be reshaped quickly. Narrow diets offered no alternatives. Long life cycles delayed response. What had once delayed collapse now amplified it. Strength postponed failure but did not prevent it. It allowed systems to endure stress longer without adaptation. Damage accumulated beneath the surface while external form remained intact. When limits were finally reached, decline accelerated rather than slowed. There was little capacity left to respond. Stability worked differently. It did not prevent stress. It reduced the consequences of stress by distributing them. Flexible systems absorbed shocks through many small adjustments rather than one large correction. Loss in one area opened space elsewhere. Diversity provided backup routes for energy and function. Failure occurred locally without spreading rapidly. At the level of ecosystems, this difference shaped outcomes profoundly. Systems built around power concentrated risk. When dominant forms declined, their absence destabilized many relationships at once. Systems built around stability shared influence across many participants. No single loss carried total weight. This contrast explained why certain organisms persisted quietly while others rose impressively and vanished. Survival over long spans favored those that could accommodate unpredictability. The ability to change direction mattered more than the ability to hold ground indefinitely. Power shaped the present, stability shaped the future. Power relied on conditions staying familiar. Stability assumed they would not. One delayed collapse, the other reduced its likelihood. This difference did not mean that flexible organisms always thrived immediately. They often appeared unremarkable. They competed modestly. They occupied edges and transitions rather than centers. Their success unfolded slowly, over many generations, often unnoticed. Overbuilt organisms, by contrast, defined eras. They set the visual tone of landscapes. Their presence dominated memory. They represented the peak of what conditions allowed. But peaks were brief in deep time. They depended on alignment that rarely lasted. As the world continued its slow movement, the importance of stability grew clearer. Environmental shifts did not announce themselves loudly. They crept. Temperature drifted. Resources redistributed. Patterns changed unevenly. Systems that required precision struggled. Systems that tolerated variation persisted. This was not a failure of strength. Strength had value. It bought time. It allowed survival under intense pressure. But strength alone could not guarantee continuity. Without flexibility, it became a temporary shield against forces that eventually demanded response. Stability prevents collapse by making collapse unnecessary. It reduced the need for dramatic correction by allowing constant, quiet adjustment. It favored forms that could bend rather than resist, disperse rather than concentrate, adapt rather than endure unchanged. In the long story of life, this principle remained consistent. The most enduring designs were rarely the most imposing. They were the ones that left space for uncertainty, that carried options rather than commitments, and that treated change not as an enemy to be resisted, but as a condition to be lived within. Change arrived quietly, as it usually does in deep time, not as catastrophe or collapse, but as subtle adjustment. Temperatures drifted by small degrees. Rain fell a little earlier or a little later. Winds shifted their familiar paths. None of these changes would have mattered much in a world built with slack and flexibility, but this world had been tuned tightly, refined for efficiency and constant throughput. Minor climate shifts altered food supply first. Plants responded gently but decisively. Growth patterns changed. Some leaves emerged later. Some flowers bloomed out of sync with long-established rhythms. Nutrients moved differently through soil and water. Productivity did not vanish, but it relocated and reordered itself. For organisms dependent on specific timing and composition, these quiet changes felt large. Highly tuned systems reacted sharply. Herbivores arrived expecting abundance and found it thinner, not absent but delayed or scattered. Feeding times stretched longer. Energy budgets slipped out of alignment. Small shortfalls accumulated across days and seasons. Bodies built to operate near capacity felt these losses immediately. Predators followed those shifts closely. Hunting strategies depended on predictable prey movement. When herds altered routes or timing, pursuit cost more energy than it returned. Missed opportunities carried greater weight than before. Recovery between hunts grew shorter. Injuries healed more slowly under constant demand. These effects moved outward through ecosystems like a slow vibration. A local shortage spread pressure beyond its origin. Grazers pushed into neighboring regions. Predators followed. Competition intensified where resources remained reliable, accelerating depletion there as well. What began as a modest adjustment in climate cascaded through networks already stretched thin. Shock rippled unevenly. Some areas absorbed change briefly before faltering. Others declined quickly. The lack of redundancy meant there were few alternate pathways for energy to flow. When one link weakened, others strained to compensate, often unsuccessfully. Recovery lagged because systems had little room to respond. Populations could not rebound quickly when reproduction was slow and resources uncertain. Space to expand into was already occupied. Adaptive shifts required generations that the present conditions did not grant generously. The timing of these shocks mattered as much as their size. Changes arrived while organisms were already committed to demanding designs. There was no pause in which to adjust gradually. Stress layered onto stress. Even when conditions stabilized temporarily, recovery did not catch up before the next shift arrived. These reactions revealed how sensitive the system had become. It was not that life lacked strength or complexity. It had both in abundance, but it lacked tolerance. The margin between functioning and failure had narrowed so much that small disturbances produced large effects. This sensitivity did not always end in immediate loss. Sometimes it appeared as thinning populations or shortened lifespans, sometimes as reduced reproductive success, sometimes as altered behavior that introduced new competition or stress elsewhere. The system remained active, but its responses grew sharper and less forgiving. Over time, these ripples changed the character of ecosystems. Stability, once provided by gradual correction, gave way to oscillation. Periods of relative calm alternated with bursts of strain. Each episode left residue in the form of reduced diversity, delayed recovery, or increased dependence on specific conditions. Life continued, but it did so under heightened tension. Success depended on timing becoming favorable again soon enough. Persistence relied on avoiding too many disruptions in close succession. The world had become sensitive to its own motion. These were not dramatic turning points marked by singular events. They were accumulations of small shifts whose effects multiplied through tightly coupled systems. The quiet nature of the changes made them easy to overlook while they were happening. Only their consequences made them visible. Small changes had always shaped life, but now they carried disproportionate influence. In a world refined for efficiency and scale, even slight alterations in climate or resource flow sent waves through ecosystems already balanced at the edge of their capacity. Recovery followed, but slowly, always a step behind the next adjustment, leaving life moving forward under lingering strain rather than restored equilibrium. As small disruptions continued to ripple through ecosystems, a deeper problem revealed itself quietly but persistently. Recovery, once an automatic response to loss, began to stall. Life could still endure pressure for a time, but it struggled to replace what was lost. The mechanisms that once restored balance had been weakened by the very traits that had brought success. Large bodies reproduced slowly. Growth required time, steady feeding, and favorable conditions over long stretches. From birth to maturity, years passed filled with vulnerability. Parents invested heavily in each offspring, guiding and protecting them through extended development. This strategy worked well when survival was reliable and loss was rare. It produced durable individuals, but few of them. When populations declined, replacement lagged. A missed breeding season could not be corrected quickly. Even several years of favorable conditions might only restore part of what had been lost. Meanwhile, pressure continued. Competition did not pause. Predators did not wait. The environment continued its slow adjustments, demanding responses that took longer than available windows allowed. Population rebounds fell behind losses not because conditions were immediately hostile, but because time itself became the limiting factor. Recovery required stability that no longer persisted long enough. Just as numbers began to rise, another disruption arrived. The system operated in a state of partial repair, never fully restored before facing new stress. This imbalance accumulated quietly. Each decline removed individuals that carried knowledge, structure, and reproductive potential. Social systems frayed. Migration routes lost participants. Genetic diversity narrowed. Even when numbers appeared sufficient, something essential had thinned. Each disruption left permanent damage, not always visible, not always dramatic, but lasting. A local extinction removed a pathway for energy flow that never reformed. A population bottleneck reduced variation in ways that limited future adaptability. Lost interactions were not always replaced by new ones. The system moved forward with missing pieces. These losses compounded because there was no buffer left. In earlier times, empty niches invited expansion and innovation. Now, space remained crowded even in decline. Vacancies were filled quickly by organisms already present, not by renewed diversity. Recovery filled gaps with repetition rather than restoration. Large bodies also constrained movement. When conditions deteriorated locally, relocation was slow or impossible. Heavy organisms could not disperse quickly to new habitats. Juveniles often perished before reaching safer areas. Losses clustered rather than spreading out, deepening local collapse. Energy demands further restricted recovery. Surviving individuals required constant resources just to persist. Little surplus remained for reproduction. During stress, organisms chose survival over growth, extending lifespans at the cost of replacing themselves. This choice made sense in the moment, but weakened populations over time. Resilience, defined as the ability to absorb disturbance and return to previous function, faded from the system. What remained was endurance without renewal. Life held on, but it did so narrowly, without the capacity to rebuild fully. This change did not announce itself suddenly. It appeared in longer recovery times, in repeated declines, in populations that never quite reached former levels. Each cycle left the system slightly diminished. The losses were small enough individually to seem tolerable, yet together they reshaped the landscape of possibility. The absence of resilience altered how ecosystems responded to further change. Instead of adapting gradually, they drifted toward thresholds where small additional stress caused outsized impact. With each passing generation, the distance between functioning and failure narrowed. By the time recovery became impossible, the system still looked active. Life persisted, moved, fed, and reproduced, but its foundation had thinned. The capacity to rebuild after loss had been traded for durability in the present. This trade marked a turning point. Survival had become about holding on rather than renewing. Strength delayed disappearance, but without resilience, endurance turned into slow decline. The world continued to move, carrying life with it, even as the quiet mechanisms that once restored balance slipped away beyond reach. As recovery faltered and resilience faded, evolution itself began to change its tone. Earlier in life's long history, variation had spread outward in many directions at once. New forms appeared freely, some lasting briefly, others laying foundations for entire lineages. The world offered room to try, to fail, and to try again. Experimentation was not efficient, but it was abundant. That openness had slowly closed. In the crowded, demanding world that now existed, exploration became risky. New strategies required time, space, and tolerance for loss, all of which had grown scarce. Survival favored refinement over novelty. Instead of branching outward, evolution turned inward, polishing what already worked. Early life had behaved like a restless wanderer. Simple bodies explored different shapes, sizes, and metabolisms. Energy flowed through many pathways. If one strategy faltered, another expanded to fill the space. Diversity arose not because it was optimal, but because the system could afford it. Now, the system could not. Late stage ecosystems ran close to their limits. Energy moved through narrow channels. Space filled quickly. Competition punished inefficiency immediately. In this environment, experimental forms rarely lasted long enough to establish themselves. Most were removed quietly, not because they were flawed, but because they did not match existing demands closely enough. Evolution continued, but its focus narrowed. Traits were refined rather than reimagined. Bodies became better versions of what already existed. Armor grew thicker. Weapons grew more precise. Size adjusted incrementally. These changes improved performance within familiar conditions, but they did not open new directions. Innovation slowed because the cost of failure grew too high. An experiment that failed early removed individuals that could not easily be replaced. A lineage that wandered too far from proven design risked disappearing entirely. Selection became conservative, favoring continuity over creativity. This shift reduced the number of viable strategies. Where many approaches once coexisted, only a few remained competitive. Ecosystems filled with variations on similar themes. Diversity remained visible in detail, but narrow in structure. Different species occupied similar roles, differing mainly in degree rather than kind. Niches that once supported multiple approaches collapsed into singular solutions. The system rewarded dominance rather than balance. Redundant pathways disappeared, replaced by streamlined flows of energy optimized for present conditions. This made ecosystems efficient, but fragile. As diversity narrowed, interactions grew more predictable. Food webs simplified. Relationships repeated themselves across regions. Local extinctions removed unique functions that were not restored. Over time, ecosystems lost subtlety, becoming collections of familiar roles filled by fewer types of organisms. The absence of experimentation affected adaptability directly. New challenges required new responses, but the pool of available strategies had shrunk. Innovation could no longer arise quickly because the system no longer tolerated deviation. Change demanded redesign rather than adjustment, and redesign took time the system could not spare. This narrowing also altered evolutionary tempo. Instead of bursts of novelty, change unfolded as slow modification within tight bounds. Progress became incremental and cautious. The dramatic leaps that once reshaped life's trajectory grew rare. The world still felt full and active, yet its possibilities had diminished. Life moved vigorously within established limits, but it no longer explored beyond them. The edges where new forms once emerged had been smoothed away by competition and constraint. This was not stagnation, but it was confinement. Evolution continued to operate faithfully, selecting what survived best in the present moment. The difference lay in what the present allowed. With little room for error, the system favored repetition over discovery. When evolution stopped experimenting, it did not announce its decision. It simply followed the path of least resistance in a world that demanded reliability above all else. Diversity narrowed not because life lost creativity, but because the environment no longer permitted it. The result was a living world rich in refinement but poor in options, impressive in scale yet limited in response. It functioned smoothly within familiar boundaries, even as its ability to imagine new ones quietly slipped away. By this stage, life was no longer spreading outward, it was pressing inward, filling every available space until little room remained to move. Ecosystems ran near capacity, not just in visible mass, but in demand. Energy, nutrients, space, and time were all spoken for. Nothing lay idle, nothing waited quietly in reserve. Forests held as much growth as soil and light could support. Oceans carried dense layers of life stacked through water and depth. Grasslands bent under constant grazing. Even the margins were occupied, not by pioneers testing new ground, but by specialists clinging to narrow openings. Life had learned to use almost everything, leaving little unused potential behind. In earlier worlds, this fullness would have been followed by branching. Excess would spill into new strategies or unexplored niches. Now, there were few places left to spill into. Every pathway was already claimed. Every role had an owner. Expansion meant displacement rather than discovery. Because of this, redundancy vanished. Multiple species no longer shared similar functions with ease. Energy flowed through fewer channels, refined for efficiency rather than safety. When one organism declined, there was often no equivalent ready to take its place. The system had been streamlined to the point where backup plans were considered wasteful. This efficiency made the world appear orderly. Processes ran smoothly when undisturbed. Resources moved quickly from one level to the next. Waste was minimal. Every component worked hard and continuously. But this same efficiency removed cushioning. There was no slack left to absorb error. Failure, when it occurred, cascaded quickly. A drop in one population increased pressure on others immediately. When prey declined, predators declined soon after. When vegetation faltered, grazers followed. The effects did not remain local for long. They traveled outward through tightly connected networks, gaining strength rather than losing it. Because redundancy was gone, recovery pathways were limited. Lost functions were not replaced easily. The absence of one role forced remaining organisms to stretch beyond their designs, often unsuccessfully. Systems adjusted by becoming simpler rather than resilient, shedding complexity to survive rather than rebuilding it. At maximum load, timing mattered more than strength. A slight mismatch between supply and demand could tip balance. A delayed season, an altered current, a brief drought could push stress systems past thresholds they could not retreat from. The same disturbance that once would have been tolerated now carried lasting consequences. Stability, under these conditions, no longer arose from structure alone, it depended on circumstances aligning favorably. Good years mattered disproportionately. A stretch of predictable conditions allowed systems to persist. A run of poor ones depleted what little reserve remained. Survival became a matter of sequence rather than design. Luck entered the story quietly. Not randomness, but contingency. Which regions experienced relief first? Which populations encountered favorable timing? Which interactions remained intact long enough to support others? Systems did not fail everywhere at once, but they no longer failed independently either. This reliance on luck marked a profound shift. Stability was no longer built into the fabric of ecosystems. It emerged only when external conditions happened to cooperate. When they did not, there was no internal margin left to compensate. Life still looked abundant. Bodies moved through landscapes heavy with presence. Sound, motion, and interaction filled every moment. From the surface, the world appeared alive and powerful. Yet beneath that activity, the system balanced precariously, held together by continuity rather than capacity. At maximum load, persistence did not mean health. It meant endurance under constant strain. Systems could continue functioning, but they could not easily absorb surprise. They did not have room to stumble and recover. Every misstep carried weight. This condition did not demand immediate collapse. It demanded precision. Everything had to go right, or at least not too wrong, for long enough. The longer this state continued, the more it depended on favorable circumstances rather than adaptive strength. Life had reached a point where it used nearly all that the world offered, but in doing so, it left itself exposed. The system stood tall and full, impressive in scale and complexity, even as its footing grew narrow, supported less by resilience than by the quiet hope that tomorrow would look enough like today. As life approached its limits, its most striking features grew louder rather than quieter. Size increased, armor thickened, growth accelerated wherever it could. To an outside observer, these extremes might have appeared as a final triumph, a sign that life had reached an unmatched peak. Yet in deep time, excess often speaks not of strength, but of strain. Extremes tend to appear when balance has already thinned. When systems function comfortably, they regulate themselves gently. Growth rises and falls. Populations expand and contract. Traits remain moderate because moderation works. When regulation weakens, compensation takes its place. Systems stretch in one direction to counter pressure building elsewhere. Excess becomes a response, not a goal. Overgrowth often emerges under these conditions. Plants grow faster and thicker, not because the environment is perfectly tuned, but because other constraints have loosened. Nutrients cycle rapidly. Competitors are crowded out. Predation patterns shift. Growth surges forward unchecked, filling space quickly, sometimes too quickly. This surge looks productive, but it masks underlying instability. The same pattern appears in animal life. Larger bodies and more extreme traits emerge when immediate pressures reward them, even if they introduce long-term cost. Escalation fills gaps left by failing balance. When systems lose their ability to correct smoothly, they overcorrect instead. In healthy systems, feedback arrives early and softly. When growth pushes too far, resources thin. When populations rise, competition restrains them. When traits become costly, selection trims them back. These responses keep extremes rare and temporary. Near collapse, feedback arrives late and blunt. Growth continues until limits are reached suddenly. Correction comes not through gradual adjustment, but through loss. What might have been a minor check becomes a major reset. Extremes, therefore, act as signals. They mark places where systems have lost fine control. When bodies become enormous, when armor dominates form, when specialization narrows life into rigid channels, these are not signs of optimization. They are signs that alternatives have dwindled. Overgrowth precedes correction because it is easier than restraint. Adding more mass, more defense, more intensity feels like progress when options are few. It delays immediate failure while narrowing future paths. The system buys time by spending flexibility. This spending cannot continue indefinitely. Eventually, excess collides with limits that do not bend. Energy runs short, space fills, timing slips. Correction arrives not as refinement, but as removal. Extremes disappear more completely than moderate forms because they have fewer ways to adapt. In the fossil record, this pattern repeats quietly. Periods marked by extraordinary size, complexity, or dominance often sit close to disruption. The very features that make these organisms memorable also make them vulnerable. They represent solutions tuned to narrow conditions rather than robust responses to change. Health, in ecological terms, rarely announces itself with spectacle. It appears as variability, redundancy, and restraint. It supports many forms doing similar things in slightly different ways. It allows systems to absorb surprise without dramatic response. Extremes, by contrast, concentrate effort. They rely on precision. They tolerate little deviation. They perform impressively, while conditions remain favorable and falter quickly when they do not. This does not mean extremes are mistakes. They are natural outcomes of selection under pressure. Evolution produces what works now, not what will endure longest. When the environment rewards excess, excess appears. The warning lies not in the existence of extremes, but in their abundance. When many organisms converge on maximal traits, it suggests that moderate strategies no longer suffice. It indicates a world where margins have narrowed so much that survival demands intensity. That demand itself signals stress. As this age drew on, the signs became clearer. Life had not grown stronger in the ways that mattered most. It had grown louder, heavier, and more committed. The landscape filled with forms that stretched systems close to their limits. Extremes did not represent balance achieved. They represented balance strained. They were the visible edges of a system leaning too far, not the center of one at ease. By the time the world reached this point, life gave every appearance of permanence. Forests stood dense and layered, oceans moved with thick currents of living mass, and land trembled beneath the steady passage of large bodies. Everywhere, motion suggested confidence. Feeding continued, reproduction persisted, interaction filled every moment. To an observer within that world, it would have seemed difficult to imagine an ending. Life appeared unstoppable because it occupied nearly everything it could. It had pushed into every usable corner, refined every available pathway, and converted energy into form with remarkable efficiency. Dominant organisms endured repeated stress without visible decline. Losses occurred, but the system compensated just enough to continue. Day followed day. Season followed season. The surface story looked stable. Yet beneath that appearance, the structure of the world had grown fragile. Not weak in the sense of softness, but brittle, like material hardened too far. Systems no longer bent easily. They held their shape until they cracked. The same efficiency that allowed life to fill the planet had removed its ability to absorb strain gently. Brittleness came from commitment. Bodies were committed to size. Diets were committed to specific resources. Behaviors were committed to precise timing. Food webs were committed to narrow flows of energy. Each commitment worked well under familiar conditions and poorly outside them. Together, they formed a world that functioned impressively, but only within a limited range of possibility. The absence of redundancy made this brittleness more dangerous. When something failed, there were few alternatives waiting. No reserve populations, no parallel strategies, no empty niches to soften impact. Correction no longer happened through substitution, it happened through loss. Collapse did not require overwhelming force, it required only a trigger, a disruption large enough to push systems beyond their narrow tolerance, but not necessarily dramatic on its own. A shift in climate rhythm, a change in sea level, a disruption to productivity. Any one of these, arriving at the wrong moment, could begin a cascade. Once initiated, collapse traveled quickly through tightly connected systems. Decline in one area increased pressure elsewhere. Stress moved faster than recovery. Loss fed further loss. Because the system ran near capacity, there was no room to isolate damage. What made this world particularly vulnerable was that its groundwork had already been laid long before any visible collapse. The conditions for failure were built into success itself: escalation without restraint, specialization without flexibility, growth without buffering. Each choice made sense in its moment. Together, they formed a structure that required stability it could no longer guarantee. The illusion of invulnerability delayed response. Because life continued to thrive until it did not, there were no gradual warnings that invited adaptation. Systems did not weaken slowly. They functioned well, then failed abruptly. The distance between apparent health and actual stability had grown wide. This is often how resets in deep time begin, not with clear decline, but with confidence, not with scarcity, but with abundance stretched too far. The world before the reset is often the fullest, most crowded, most impressive version of itself. The system had done everything it could with the rules it followed. Evolution had pushed traits forward faithfully. Ecosystems had optimized for present success. Energy had been used fully. Nothing remained unused. Nothing waited patiently to step in. When the trigger arrived, it did not encounter a weak world. It encountered a rigid one. A world excellent at persisting, unchanged, and poor at adjusting. A world prepared for known pressures and unprepared for surprise. This moment, just before everything shifted, was not an ending. It was a condition, a state where life had reached its limits quietly, without realizing it. The reset did not come from nowhere. It emerged from the accumulated choices of millions of years, each sensible on its own, each narrowing the future slightly more. The world stood full and alive, shaped by its own success, balanced on foundations that had been laid carefully and unknowingly for what would come next. Long before collapse reshaped the world, small signs appeared and passed almost unnoticed. They did not arrive as alarms or sudden breaks. They settled gently into the background, blending with the ordinary rhythms of life. Only much later would they be recognized as warnings. Recovery slowed first. Disturbances that once faded within seasons now lingered across generations. A forest, thinned by stress, did not quite return to its former density. A population reduced by shortage grew back, but never fully. Losses became something to endure rather than correct. The world still healed, but the process took longer each time, stretching patience and masking vulnerability behind continued motion. These delays were easy to explain away. Conditions had changed slightly. Competition was stronger. Life was more complex. None of this felt unusual in isolation. The planet had always shifted, and living systems had always adjusted. Yet beneath these explanations lay a subtle pattern. Recovery no longer matched disruption. The gap widened slowly, quietly. At the same time, specialization increased. Organisms grew more refined in their habits and forms. Diets narrowed further. Behaviors synchronized tightly with specific seasons or resources. Success rewarded precision, and precision replaced breadth. Each lineage grew better at doing one thing very well and less capable of doing anything else. This specialization felt like progress. Efficiency improved, interactions became smoother, energy moved with less waste. For long periods, the benefits were clear. But every refinement reduced options, leaving fewer ways to respond when conditions drifted. Tolerance to change declined alongside this refinement. Systems that once absorbed variation now reacted sharply to it. Small deviations produced outsized responses. A mild shift in temperature altered growth patterns significantly. A modest change in timing disrupted feeding and reproduction. Flexibility that had once softened transitions had been thinned away. None of this happened everywhere at once. Some regions remained robust longer than others. Some species adapted better. The unevenness made patterns harder to see. The world still looked alive and active. Motion covered fragility effectively. These signals were quiet because they did not break anything immediately. They adjusted expectations instead. Life learned to live with slightly lower recovery, slightly narrower tolerance, slightly higher dependence on stability. Each shift felt manageable. Taken together, they marked a trajectory that was difficult to perceive from within. In hindsight, these warning signs align clearly. Slower recovery reduced resilience, increased specialization reduced adaptability, reduced tolerance to change amplified impact. But at the time, they felt like ordinary costs of success. The world had grown crowded, productive, and competitive. Trade offs were expected. Even scientists, reading the record millions of years later, must trace these patterns carefully. They do not announce themselves as failure. They appear as trends, not events. They require distance to be seen. The most telling sign was not collapse itself, but the loss of margin. Systems continued to function well, but only under increasingly specific conditions. The range of states in which life could thrive narrowed steadily. Stability became less of a property and more of a requirement. These signals remained invisible because nothing forced attention upon them. There was no single moment that demanded response. The world moved forward, confident in its momentum. Each generation inherited a system slightly less forgiving than the one before, without realizing it. The quiet nature of these warnings explains why correction did not come early. Evolution responded to immediate success, not long-term risk. Organisms survived well enough in the present, and that was enough to continue. No mechanism existed to recognize the gradual erosion of resilience. Only later, when systems failed quickly and broadly, would these early signs be recognized for what they were, not causes, but symptoms. Not mistakes, but indicators of a system stretched close to its limits. In the living moment, these warnings whispered rather than shouted. They blended into the background noise of a busy world. Only with time and distance do they form a clear message, revealing how long the foundations had been shifting beneath the surface, even while life appeared stable and strong. For a long time, the world carried its weight without obvious complaint. Pressure accumulated slowly, layered gently across millions of quiet years. Each small strain seemed manageable on its own. A slightly warmer season here, a delayed recovery there, a narrower tolerance, a slower rebound. None of these changes demanded immediate response. Life adjusted just enough to continue, and continuation was mistaken for stability. This gradual accumulation was almost invisible from within the system. Like sediment settling at the bottom of still water, pressure built without motion. Ecosystems adapted to operating closer to their limits, learning to function with less margin and fewer options. Each generation inherited a world already stretched, and because it had always been stretched, the condition felt normal. The key difference between earlier ages and this one lay in how stress was stored. In resilient systems, pressure is released frequently and gently. Small corrections occur all the time. Populations rise and fall. Species shift roles. Energy pathways reroute quietly. Stress is dispersed through flexibility. Here, stress was held instead of released. Efficiency replaced buffering. Specialization replaced redundancy. Strength replaced adaptability. Pressure was absorbed by endurance rather than adjustment. The system did not fracture early because its strongest elements resisted change well. They held firm, masking the strain beneath. But pressure does not disappear simply because it is endured. It accumulates, and when it can no longer be contained, release is not gradual. The release was rapid because systems had become tightly coupled. Everything depended on everything else moving in sequence. When one critical element slipped beyond tolerance, it pulled others with it. A decline in one population intensified pressure on another. A shift in productivity destabilized multiple food webs at once. Feedback loops amplified rather than softened disturbance. This is the nature of nonlinear failure. Systems appear stable right up until they are not. There is no clear midpoint between functioning and collapse. The transition is abrupt because the structure has lost intermediate states. It can operate within a narrow range or fail outside it, with little room in between. When the trigger arrived, it did not need to be extraordinary. It only needed to push conditions past thresholds that had been quietly narrowing for ages. Once crossed, correction could not keep pace. Decline accelerated faster than recovery could respond. What followed felt sudden because there had been no visible preparation. Life had not gradually diminished into weakness. It had surged into fullness. The world looked busy, productive, and alive until the moment patterns broke. Collapse arrived not as a long fade, but as a sharp turn. Inevitability does not mean predictability from within. From inside the system, every step felt reasonable. Every adaptation solved a real problem. Every refinement brought short-term success. There was no obvious choice to make differently without knowledge of what lay ahead. From the outside, with distance, the arc becomes clearer. A system that removes its buffers, narrows its options, and relies on constant stability sets itself on a path where failure requires only time and chance. Once resilience is gone, collapse is no longer a possibility among many. It becomes the only remaining outcome when conditions change. The ending was sudden because correction had been postponed for too long. Gradual release had been replaced by endurance. When endurance failed, nothing slowed the fall. This pattern repeats across deep time. Long periods of apparent success give way to brief intervals of intense loss. The duration of stability masks the speed of collapse. The longer pressure builds without release, the faster the system moves once limits are breached. In this world, collapse was not a surprise to the structure itself. It was the natural consequence of how life had organized. The groundwork had been laid patiently, almost gently, over ages of growth and refinement. When the moment came, the system did exactly what such systems do. It failed all at once, not because it was weak, but because it had become too rigid to bend any further. When the collapse swept through the living world, it did not erase life evenly. Loss moved fast and wide, but survival followed quieter lines. Some forms endured not because they were strong or dominant, but because they were prepared in a different way. What remained revealed which traits had carried hidden value all along. Smaller bodies endured first. They asked less of the world to remain alive. Their daily needs were modest compared to the giants that had once ruled space and attention. Where massive forms required constant feeding and stable conditions, smaller organisms could survive on interrupted supply. Missed meals were damaging, but not immediately fatal. Shortages that pushed large bodies past limits could be endured, at least temporarily, by those built lighter. These bodies were also quicker to mature and reproduce. When populations declined, replacement did not require long stretches of uninterrupted stability. Losses could be offset within shorter spans of time. This did not make survival easy, but it made recovery possible. Time, which had become an enemy to large forms, became an ally again. Flexible strategies persisted alongside small size. Organisms that had retained broad diets found options where specialists found none. They shifted between food sources, behaviors, and habitats with relative ease. When familiar resources disappeared, they experimented quietly, not perfectly, but enough to continue. Flexibility turned disruption into inconvenience rather than catastrophe. Behavior mattered as much as form. Some species altered activity patterns, feeding at different times or moving through new spaces. Others adjusted reproduction, delaying it or accelerating it in response to conditions. These changes were not dramatic reinventions. They were small adjustments made possible by not being locked into one way of living. Lower energy needs mattered more than any single trait. Survival favored designs that burned slowly. Metabolisms that did not demand constant input allowed organisms to wait out poor conditions. Energy could be conserved rather than spent immediately. This reserve, however small, created breathing room. Lower demand also meant less dependency on precise timing. If resources arrived late or unpredictably, survival could continue. The margin between enough and not enough widened just enough to matter. In a world where many systems had collapsed under tight constraints, these margins proved decisive. Adaptability emerged as the quiet winner, not dominance, not size, not strength. Adaptability allowed life to persist through change rather than resist it. It enabled organisms to adjust step by step as conditions shifted rather than holding form until breaking. This adaptability did not always produce abundance. Survivors often lived in smaller numbers, spread thinly across recovering landscapes, but they endured. They maintained footholds where others vanished completely. From these footholds, new systems could eventually grow. The survivors were not necessarily new or innovative. Many had existed alongside the giants all along, overshadowed by their scale and spectacle. They occupied edges, understories, burrows, shallow waters, and transient spaces. They were common rather than remarkable. Their value lay in how little they required and how much variation they could tolerate. In the wake of collapse, ecosystems reorganized around these traits. Food webs rebuilt from the bottom and sides rather than the top. Energy flowed through many small channels rather than a few large ones. Redundancy returned slowly as diverse forms filled similar roles again. The lesson written into this recovery was subtle. Survival favored not those best adapted to a single moment, but those able to endure many moments that were different from each other. Flexibility restored what rigidity had lost. Life continued, not by recreating its former scale immediately, but by rediscovering balance through restraint. Growth returned cautiously. Diversity expanded gradually. Systems rebuilt with more space between limits. What survived did so quietly. It did not dominate landscapes or announce success through size. It persisted through continuity, adjustment, and modest demand. In doing so, it carried forward the capacity to rebuild a living world that could bend again. Adaptability won not because it was powerful, but because it remained possible when other strategies had closed themselves off. From smaller bodies, flexible lives, and lower needs, the next chapters of life found room to begin again. After the collapse passed through the living world, silence settled briefly over many places. Not the silence of emptiness, but of reduced motion. Fewer bodies moved through landscapes. Fewer interactions filled each moment. What remained was quieter, thinner, and less imposing. Yet beneath that calm, the same process that had always guided life continued without pause. Evolution did not fail, it did not stop, it did not abandon the world. Selection continued its steady work, filtering survival and reproduction through the conditions that now existed. The rules had not changed. What changed was the direction those rules pointed toward. In the world that followed loss, excess no longer paid. Large bodies that required uninterrupted abundance struggled to persist. Highly specialized designs, once precise and powerful, found fewer situations where they fit. Armor that demanded constant repair became a burden. Weapons built for vanished opponents offered little advantage. These traits faded not because they were wrong, but because the world could no longer support them. Loss performed the correction that moderation had failed to provide. Energy demands shrank as smaller forms filled space again. Diets widened as generalists reoccupied niches. Reproductive strategies shifted toward faster cycles and broader tolerance. Without intention or foresight, selection redirected life away from extremes simply by favoring what could endure present conditions. This redirection was gentle in mechanism, but profound in effect. Traits did not disappear all at once. They thinned over generations. Lineages carrying heavy costs declined slowly, replaced by those that required less precision and less constant input. The system, once dominated by intensity, gradually leaned toward resilience. Balance returned not as symmetry or stillness, but as flexibility. Ecosystems regained redundancy as multiple organisms shared similar roles. Energy flowed through many small channels rather than a few large ones. If one pathway faltered, others remained. Recovery, once impossible, became gradual but reliable again. This balance did not recreate the world that had been lost. It formed something different. New combinations emerged from the survivors. Interactions rewired themselves around what remained. The absence of former giants opened space for variation. Evolution resumed its earlier habit of exploration, not immediately, but cautiously. What looks like correction in hindsight was simply selection responding to changed circumstances. Excess had been a response to one set of conditions. Its removal was a response to another. Neither represented error. Both reflected life adjusting to what the world allowed. This process carried a cost. Many forms vanished permanently. Entire strategies ended. The correction was not gentle for those adapted to the previous world. Balance returned through loss, not through compromise. Life does not negotiate its corrections. It enforces them through differential survival. Yet this enforcement restored properties that had been missing. Systems regained margin. Tolerance widened. The distance between functioning and failure increased. The world could again absorb small disruptions without cascading collapse. Selection continued to reward success, but success now looked different. It favored persistence over dominance, continuity over speed, breadth over precision. Traits that worked across many conditions spread more reliably than those tuned to one. This shift did not eliminate complexity, it reshaped it. Instead of towering forms and singular flows of energy, complexity appeared as interconnection and variation. Life became less dramatic and more stable, less impressive at a glance, more durable over time. The story written into this correction is not one of punishment or reset for its own sake. It is a reminder that evolution does not aim toward any endpoint. It follows opportunity. When opportunity narrows, it narrows with it. When opportunity widens, it explores again. The balance that returned was not perfect or permanent. It was provisional, as all balances are, but it carried an important difference. It left room, room for adjustment, room for error, room for change. Through loss, life regained flexibility. Through thinning, it regained resilience. Through correction, it continued, altered but unbroken, carrying forward the same process that had shaped every era before. Evolution did not fail. It simply followed where survival now led. After balance began to return through loss, a clearer distinction emerged in the quiet rebuilding of the world. It was a distinction that had always existed, though it had been easy to overlook when abundance flowed freely. The difference lay between growth and sustainability, between expanding quickly and lasting gently. Growth amplifies success. When conditions are favorable, growth turns advantage into presence. Bodies become larger, populations expand, energy is converted rapidly into form. Growth fills space, claims resources, and reshapes environments to match what already works. It feels dynamic, forward moving, and powerful. In earlier chapters of this story, growth drove escalation, dominance, and spectacle. Growth excels at seizing the moment. It multiplies what succeeds now and spreads it widely. When stability is high and limits are distant, growth appears endlessly beneficial. It rewards speed, intensity, and commitment. In such times, restraint can seem unnecessary or even wasteful. But growth does not ask whether conditions will remain favorable. It assumes continuity. It spends future flexibility to maximize present advantage. As long as the world cooperates, this exchange feels fair. Sustainability works differently. It preserves success rather than expanding it. It favors designs that leave room for interruption, variation, and repair. It accepts slower gains in exchange for endurance. Where growth fills space quickly, sustainability leaves space unfilled on purpose. Sustainable systems maintain margins. They keep energy demands below absolute maximum. They allow overlap and redundancy. They support multiple ways of doing similar things so that failure in one area does not spread unchecked. Sustainability does not eliminate change, it absorbs it. In the world before collapse, growth and sustainability were treated as the same goal. Expanding dominance was mistaken for long-term security. Systems optimized for productivity without preserving buffers. Every gain was reinvested into further expansion. This confusion carried cost that only became visible when conditions shifted. Growth amplified success until success itself became a liability. Bodies grew large enough to depend on uninterrupted supply. Ecosystems filled tightly enough to lose redundancy. Specialization sharpened performance while erasing alternatives. What had once ensured survival now narrowed it. Sustainability, by contrast, emerged from the survivors. It did not recreate former heights quickly, it rebuilt cautiously. Energy flowed through smaller forms and flexible strategies. Growth resumed, but within boundaries that allowed recovery. The system accepted less intensity to regain tolerance. This difference explains why earlier worlds collapsed suddenly, while later ones stabilized more gradually. Growth alone pushed systems toward edges where minor disruption caused cascading failure. Sustainability pulled systems back from those edges by widening the range of conditions under which life could function. Confusing growth with sustainability invites collapse because it encourages spending all available capacity. When systems operate at maximum output continuously, there is no reserve left for stress. Recovery requires spare capacity, not just efficiency. Without it, every disruption becomes cumulative. The lesson appears repeatedly in deep time. Periods marked by rapid expansion and extreme traits often precede abrupt loss. Periods marked by moderation and diversity tend to persist longer, even if they appear less impressive. This does not mean growth is harmful by nature. Growth is essential for colonization, recovery, and innovation. It brings life into new spaces and possibilities. The problem arises when growth becomes the only measure of success, when preservation is treated as stagnation rather than wisdom. Sustainability preserves what growth creates. It allows success to continue across changing conditions. It treats restraint not as limitation, but as protection. In doing so, it ensures that life can remain present even when circumstances fluctuate. In the quiet rebuilding of the world, this difference shaped everything that followed. Expansion returned slowly, guided by limits that had once been ignored. Diversity reemerged alongside redundancy. Systems grew again, but not all at once, and not everywhere. The story of this age reveals that survival over long spans depends not on how much life can become, but on how much change it can endure. Growth amplifies success in the moment. Sustainability carries that success forward. When the two are confused, collapse becomes not an accident, but a likely outcome written quietly into the structure of progress itself. As the world settled into its quieter rhythms once more, a deeper lesson became visible beneath the layers of loss and renewal. It was not written in any single moment of collapse, nor in the slow rebuilding that followed, but in the entire arc that stretched across deep time. Natural systems do not guide themselves gently toward balance. They move, they expand, they fill what is available, and only later are they corrected by forces outside their own momentum. Life does not possess an inner sense of moderation. It does not pause because something has become too much. As long as survival and reproduction continue, expansion feels justified. Growth spreads into every open space. Specialization deepens wherever it improves efficiency. Complexity accumulates because it works now, not because it will work forever. The system does not ask where the edge lies. It discovers it by crossing it. Self-regulation exists only in a limited sense. Local feedback can restrain small excesses for a time. Scarcity trims populations. Competition narrows advantage. But when conditions remain favorable and limits soften, these checks weaken. Growth continues unchecked, not out of failure, but out of success. This is why limits are enforced externally. They arrive as changes that the system did not anticipate and could not control. Shifts in climate, chemistry, geography, or energy flow impose boundaries where internal regulation could not. These boundaries do not negotiate. They do not respond to how impressive a system has become. They simply apply pressure. Correction, when it comes, is never gentle. It does not arrive as gradual refinement. It arrives as a loss. Forms that demand too much are removed. Strategies that rely on narrow conditions fail abruptly. Entire ways of living disappear, sometimes permanently. What remains is not what was best, but what was compatible with new limits. This harshness can be difficult to reconcile with the slow, careful image often associated with evolution. But evolution itself is not gentle. It is indifferent. It preserves what survives and lets go of what does not. When systems push beyond sustainable bounds, correction does not restore them softly. It resets them. Across deep time, this pattern repeats with quiet consistency. Periods of expansion lead to overreach. Overreach invites external constraint. Constraint removes excess. Balance returns through thinning rather than adjustment. The system does not learn in the way minds do. It changes because it must. This lesson carries weight because it reveals something fundamental about how nature operates. Stability is not guaranteed by internal wisdom. It is enforced by reality. When resources become limiting, when conditions shift, when energy no longer flows as before, the system responds only through survival and loss. The aftermath of correction often looks calmer, even healthier. Diversity returns, margins widen, flexibility spreads. But this calm is not the result of foresight. It is the result of removal. What could not endure the new conditions is gone. Understanding this helps explain why collapse feels sudden and unfair when it occurs. The groundwork is laid slowly, invisibly, through long periods of success. When limits finally press back, the response feels disproportionate because it is concentrated into a short span of time. Gentle regulation failed. Force took its place. This does not make natural systems cruel or broken. It makes them honest. They reflect reality without cushioning its consequences. They reveal that longevity depends not on how far growth can be pushed, but on how well systems remain aligned with their environment. The deeper lesson hidden in deep time is that balance is not a destination reached through effort alone. It is a condition maintained only as long as limits are respected. When they are not, respect is enforced. Life continues despite this, not because it avoids correction, but because it can survive it. Loss clears space, limits reshape possibility. From what remains, new systems form, carrying forward the same patterns under new constraints. Correction is never gentle, but it is effective. It removes what no longer fits and leaves room for what can. In this way, the story of life is not one of steady self-control, but of repeated adjustment to a world that ultimately decides how much is enough. As the story stretches outward through time, one pattern returns with quiet persistence. It does not belong to a single era or a single collapse. It appears whenever life finds a long stretch of stability and learns to trust it. In these calm intervals, escalation emerges naturally, not because the system is failing, but because it is working too well. Stable systems encourage commitment. When conditions remain predictable, traits that exploit those conditions deepen. Bodies grow larger, behaviors specialize, energy pathways streamline. Each refinement improves success within the present environment. Over time, these refinements stack, creating systems that excel under current rules. Escalation thrives in such moments because resistance fades. When threats remain familiar and resources continue to flow, there is little reason to maintain broader tolerance. Traits that sacrifice flexibility for efficiency are rewarded. Redundancy looks wasteful. Exploration seems unnecessary. The system leans into what works and leaves the rest behind. Success breeds rigidity slowly. It does not feel like a choice. Each generation inherits a world that still rewards existing strategies. Narrowing appears rational. Commitment seems safe. No immediate penalty discourages overspecialization or growth beyond earlier limits. This is why escalation often follows long periods of apparent health. When systems are unstable, escalation is trimmed quickly. Excess is punished early. Only in stable environments can traits grow extreme without immediate cost. Stability provides the time required for commitment to deepen. Rigidity becomes problematic only when conditions change, but change, by nature, arrives unevenly. It does not align with evolutionary refinement. It introduces new pressures that existing designs were never meant to meet. When change appears, it punishes overcommitment directly. Traits tuned tightly to one set of conditions struggle to respond to another. Large bodies cannot retreat quickly. Specialized diets offer no alternatives. Efficient systems break when input falters. The same features that drove success become liabilities. The severity of punishment reflects the degree of commitment. Moderately specialized organisms lose ground but adjust. Highly specialized ones decline rapidly. Overcommitment leaves no room to bend. Failure accelerates because recovery pathways have already been removed. This dynamic explains why collapse often follows success rather than scarcity. It is not the poorest systems that fail most dramatically, it is the most optimized ones. Their performance depends on consistency. When that consistency breaks, performance collapses rather than degrades gradually. The pattern repeats because the conditions that produce escalation will arise again. Earth enters long, stable phases repeatedly. Climate settles, resources flow, life fills space. Each time, the same logic applies. Success encourages refinement. Refinement reduces flexibility. Flexibility is needed when change arrives. There is no memory in the system to warn against this. Each era begins with a world shaped by previous correction, open and flexible. Over time, stability encourages exploration, then commitment, then overcommitment. The cycle does not repeat because life forgets. It repeats because selection responds only to present conditions. Change, when it comes, does not distinguish between causes. It simply applies new rules. Those prepared for variation endure. Those committed too deeply do not. The system resets, not to punish excess, but to restore compatibility between life and environment. This repetition gives deep time its rhythm. Long plateaus of refinement followed by sharp adjustments, quiet buildup followed by rapid release. The pattern is not an error in evolution. It is a consequence of how survival rewards success. In calmer periods, life leans into stability. In turbulent periods, it relearns flexibility. Neither state is permanent. Each contains the seeds of the next. Understanding this pattern reveals why balance is always temporary and why sustainability requires continuous restraint. It is not enough to build systems that work well now. Endurance requires leaving space for what may come. Escalation is not a sign of progress or failure on its own. It is a signal that stability has allowed commitment to deepen. Whether that commitment becomes dangerous depends on what the world does next. Across deep time, the answer arrives consistently. Change comes, as it always does, and it rewards those who remained able to adjust. The pattern repeats because the conditions that create it repeat, and because life, faithful to its rules, follows success until success becomes too much. As the deep rhythms of this ancient pattern settle into memory, their outline becomes strangely familiar, not because the modern world mirrors the past in detail, but because the same pressures leave similar marks. The echoes are subtle, easy to overlook, yet they move with a recognizable cadence. Energy dependence stands out first. In the ancient world, Large bodies and dense ecosystems required uninterrupted flow to persist. In the modern world, systems also rely on continuous input. Movement, growth, and stability draw from steady streams of energy that must arrive on time and at scale. When energy flows smoothly, the system feels confident and capable. When it hesitates, even briefly, tension appears immediately. This dependence encourages expansion during calm periods. As long as supply remains reliable, demand grows to match it. Efficiency improves, output increases. Structures form around the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. The cost of interruption is pushed aside, not because it has vanished, but because it feels distant. Alongside this dependence comes narrow optimization. Just as ancient organisms refined their bodies for specific conditions, modern systems refine processes for particular outcomes. Specialization increases performance within known boundaries. Redundancy is trimmed. Flexibility is treated as inefficiency. What does not serve immediate success is removed. This optimization feels rational. It rewards precision, speed, and scale. It delivers impressive results while conditions remain stable, but it also narrows the range of situations the system can handle. Alternatives fade, backup pathways weaken. The ability to shift direction becomes harder with each refinement. Reduced buffers follow naturally. When success is amplified repeatedly, capacity is filled rather than reserved. Margins shrink. Inventories run lean. Time between supply and demand shortens. Systems operate close to their limits because doing so appears productive. Buffering looks wasteful when disruption seems unlikely. These choices are not mistakes. They mirror the logic of earlier worlds that flourished under stability. Each step makes sense within its own moment. Each improves performance in the present. Together, they create structures that excel at doing one thing very well and struggle with deviation. The familiar warning signs appear quietly. Recovery from disruption takes longer. Small disturbances spread further. Adjustments that once happened smoothly become strained. Responses grow sharper rather than softer. These signals do not announce themselves as danger. They present as inconvenience, delay, or inefficiency. Because the system continues to function, concern fades quickly. Motion resumes, output returns, confidence rebuilds. The underlying pattern remains unnoticed because it does not break the surface. The world looks busy and capable, just as it did before ancient resets. What deep time teaches is not that collapse is inevitable in any specific form, but that certain arrangements carry risk regardless of era. Systems that depend heavily on continuous input, optimize narrowly, and remove buffers invite the same dynamics that shaped past endings. Stability permits commitment. Commitment deepens. Change eventually arrives. The echoes are not predictions, they are reflections. They suggest that the pressures shaping life long ago are not confined to fossils and strata. They emerge wherever success encourages overcommitment and where growth is mistaken for endurance. The ancient world did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it was designed too well for conditions that did not last. The same principle applies broadly. Systems thrive when aligned with their environment and struggle when that alignment becomes too strict. These echoes do not demand alarm. They invite awareness. They highlight the value of resilience over maximum output, of flexibility over perfection, of buffers over bare efficiency. They remind us that endurance depends less on how much a system can achieve and more on how much change it can absorb. Deep time does not offer instruction, it offers perspective. It shows how often confidence precedes correction and how quietly warning signs blend into ordinary success. The lesson is not that history repeats exactly, but that its rhythms persist. Underneath the long rise and sudden fall of this age lies a quieter truth, one that is easy to miss if attention stays fixed on shapes and scale alone. History remembers extremes because they leave deep impressions, yet the true story lives beneath those impressions, in motion rather than form. This age was not defined by monsters. The largest bodies and most dramatic designs were simply the most visible outcome of deeper forces at work. They were not the drivers of change, nor the reason the system tipped. They were passengers carried forward by a current already in motion. Their size told a story, but it was not the story itself. It was not defined by dominance either. Dominance measures control in a single moment. It tells who stands tallest when conditions align perfectly, but dominance says little about endurance. Many organisms that ruled their worlds did so briefly, flourishing under narrow windows of stability before disappearing entirely. Power did not translate into continuity. It only amplified presence while the moment lasted. What defined this age was momentum without restraint. Evolution continued to reward whatever worked in the immediate present. Each successful adaptation encouraged further commitment. Growth fed more growth. Specialization invited deeper specialization. The system did not pause to ask where limits lay, because nothing in its rules required such caution. Momentum is subtle because it does not feel reckless. It feels earned. Each step forward builds upon the last, justified by survival and reproduction. When environments remain stable, momentum looks like progress unfolding naturally. There is no obvious point at which to stop. Over time, this momentum detached life from stability. Expansion happened faster than buffering. Complexity accumulated faster than resilience. Systems grew interconnected faster than they could protect themselves from cascading failure. Life's speed exceeded its ability to recover from disturbance. In this way, the age became less about what life was and more about how fast it was moving. Growth outran correction. Commitment outran flexibility. The gap widened quietly until stability could no longer keep up. This explains why the end arrived as it did. There was no single mistake, no singular villain, no dramatic misstep. Collapse emerged from motion alone. Life had accelerated so effectively that even small changes in direction produced outsized consequences. Seen clearly, the age represents a boundary condition. It shows what happens when success compounds without breaks. It reveals that adaptation can overshoot compatibility, not because it fails, but because it works too well within a narrow frame. The most striking creatures of this time did not cause imbalance, they revealed it. Their presence signaled how far life had moved away from moderation and how much had been invested in intensity. They were milestones marking acceleration, not architects of collapse. What followed was not a lesson taught by cruelty, but by physics. Energy has limits. Time has limits. Systems cannot operate indefinitely at maximum output without losing the ability to respond. When response fails, correction arrives from outside. This age matters because it separates appearance from function. It shows that a world can look powerful, productive, and full, while quietly becoming unsustainable. That visual success can coexist with hidden fragility. That motion alone does not equal health. At its core, this age was about life growing faster than stability allowed. It tested how far growth could push before flexibility vanished. It explored the outer edge of expansion without internal restraint. The reset that followed did not erase that exploration. It incorporated it. The survivors carried forward a quieter understanding written into form rather than memory. That endurance depends on pace. That survival favors alignment over acceleration. In the long view, this age stands not as a cautionary tale spoken loudly, but as a pattern traced gently across time. It reminds us that life thrives most reliably when movement is matched by pause, when success leaves room for recovery, and when growth remains tethered to the slow rhythms of the world that must support it. What this age was really about was not spectacle or supremacy. It was about momentum discovering its limit and the quiet realization that lasting systems are shaped not by how fast they grow, but by how well they remain in step with change. As the story reaches its quiet end, the patterns traced across deep time begin to settle into something almost gentle. Not answers, not rules, but an understanding that arrives slowly, like light changing in a familiar room. What remains, after all the rise and correction, is not a warning spoken loudly, but a truth that repeats softly. Evolution favors what works now. It always has. Survival and reproduction respond to the present moment, to the conditions immediately at hand. Traits that succeed today spread today. Bodies that function well now persist now. There is no mechanism within evolution to hold back success for the sake of an unknown future. There is no memory of what once failed, and no anticipation of what may come. There is only the present, unfolding one generation at a time. This is why evolution does not favor what lasts. Longevity is not a selectable trait on its own. What lasts does so because it continues to fit, not because it was meant to endure. When conditions align for long periods, success deepens, growth accelerates, commitment strengthens. The system moves forward confidently, unaware of where the edges lie. This is how survival itself can become risky. When success compounds without restraint, the traits that ensure immediate survival may undermine long-term endurance. Efficiency replaces flexibility. Scale replaces margin. Systems grow louder, heavier, and faster, while quietly losing the ability to slow down. Balance, by contrast, rarely announces itself. It does not dominate landscapes or leave dramatic impressions. Balance is quiet. It exists in redundancy, in overlap, in unused space. It appears as tolerance rather than intensity. It allows systems to function without pressing against their limits at every moment. Because balance lacks spectacle, it is easy to overlook. It can seem unambitious, even stagnant, beside the visible triumphs of growth and dominance. Yet balance is what allows systems to absorb surprise. It is what keeps small disruptions from becoming cascading failures. It does not prevent change, but it makes change survivable. Excess is loud. It attracts attention. It fills space and reshapes environments dramatically. Excess creates icons, extremes, and memorable forms. It gives the impression of vitality and strength. But excess also signals that margins have narrowed. It indicates that growth has moved faster than correction. Across deep time, history shows which one endures. Quiet balance persists through variation. Loud excess appears briefly, then vanishes. The fossil record is filled with impressive forms that ruled their worlds for moments before disappearing completely. It is also filled, less visibly, with lineages that changed slowly, endured quietly, and continued across shifting eras. This does not mean excess is wrong. It is part of exploration. Life tests possibilities, sometimes pushing them to their limits. Without these tests, evolution would stagnate. But without balance, those tests cannot last. What this age teaches, gently and without judgment, is that endurance arises not from maximum performance, but from alignment. Systems survive longest when their pace matches the world they inhabit, when energy use leaves room for interruption, when specialization leaves room for alternatives, when success leaves space unfilled. The story does not end in failure or triumph, it ends in continuity. Life adjusts, not because it learns in the human sense, but because correction removes what no longer fits. What remains carries forward quieter traits, smaller demands, broader tolerance. From these, new stories begin. When survival becomes risky, it is often because success has crowded out safety, because motion has replaced margin, because growth has outpaced the slow rhythms of recovery. In those moments, the world responds, not with negotiation, but with change. And yet, life continues. Always. Thinner, quieter, less dramatic perhaps, but present. The lesson written across this age is not one of fear, but of proportion, that lasting systems move with the world rather than racing ahead of it. So, as the final echoes fade, what remains is not an ending, but a perspective. Balance endures because it bends, excess fades because it does not. History shows this again and again, not loudly, not urgently, but patiently, one age after another, as life finds its way forward by learning, through loss, how to last.